Okay, hello everyone. I think we can start today's meeting. Wait a minute. Okay. Hello everyone. This is today is September 14th, and this is Velero community meeting. And first we update some of the current status. We have started to preparing the V 1.192 release, and we have a collection of the issues. You can have a view of them here. And for V 1.10, we have reached the first point of the roadmap, that is the feature release. It is on today. And for the individual features, the copier integration, we have made through the workflows for both the RESIC and the copier paths from end to end. So the performance testing and the smoke testing has been started, and the port volume refactor has also been started. For the Kubuilder refactories, we have finished the last part, the repo reinsurer refactor. And it means we have done all of the work in V 1.10. Okay, that is for the overall status. And for the individual update, myself is working on copier integration items, and I have also started the port volume backup refactor. So this is some of the items of the second phase for copier integration. And besides that, I've worked on some issue investigation and fix. That's from my side. And then Xin, please.
Thanks. Recently, I created some PR to fix some corner cases for CSI plugin. And I also created a proposal for separating the resource filter parameter into cluster scope and the namespace scope. That's all.
Okay. So this one seems we will have some kind of design, and we'll have them reviewed, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah,
okay.
I already provided some feedback on that initially. I think we still need to go through some of the edge cases there. There's potential to be very confusing because we also have there's the Boolean for whether we include cluster resources at all or we exclude all of them. And then there's that kind of middle ground where we only include relevant ones. So we've got to make sure that those two interact in a way that's not confusing and doesn't lose any functionality. So we just need to be careful with that. But hopefully, I'm sure we can come up with something that works there.
Yes, right.
Yeah, Shuna, I remember you added one item in the discussion topics, but it's gone now, maybe removed by someone.
Oh,
later.
Okay.
So you add it back and we discuss it later, or you want to discuss it now?
I think I can add it back, and we can discuss it later.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. And Amin?
Yeah, I'm preparing 1 and 2 release, and we plan to release it at the end of this month. And second, I'm done the copy uploader integration. And third, and the copy integration almost finished and I am doing the Velero end-to-end performance test. That is the update from me.
Okay, thanks. And Danfeng?
Okay, first I add EKS in nightly pipeline, and due to a temporary credential issue, I only picked some basic test in this pipeline. And I had another is I had add an end-to-end test, which is opt-in and opt-out for persistent volume backup. There is some issue during this script. The opt-in test is not as expected in the as the description in the Velero.io document. I think there should be some design issue. I will look into it and discuss it within the team. That's all from my side.
Okay. Just like along with copy integration, we will refactor the doc for the pod volume backup part. So maybe we can go make the change together with the. But let's discuss some first. And Scott, please.
Yep. So just first off on the plugin versioning, this is a reduced scope from the original plan was to get the V2 version of these things in place as well. You know, that hasn't happened yet because, you know, those designs haven't been approved yet. So this is all the refactoring needed for the V1 so that we're ready to implement V2. So of that first PR is really the most important one because what's on main right now breaks backwards compatibility. And this puts things back in terms of the proto files for V1 in the original location. Without this, the existing plugins are all broken. So this one needs to be pretty much merged as soon as we can get a second review on it. The follow-on PRs that I have open are just additional refactoring needed. Basically, this puts everything in place so that when we're ready to, once we define what the V2 is, all the code is there that we need from V1. So we just need to add the V2 kind of alongside. So so this is that's for backup. This is the rest of the backup item action because about half of that refactoring was done with Fong's original PR, and then that first PR fixes the backwards compatibility, and then the one you were just looking at, the 5271, does the remaining changes needed for backup item action. And then I have one PR for restore item action and one for volume snapshotter. Those are the three plugin types that we know we need a V2 for in 111, because those are the ones where the item action plugin are going to change. So those are kind of the most important ones to get a V1 refactoring in place for. The other plugin types, object store and everything else, that refactoring will have to wait until the 111 timeframe because that hasn't been started yet. But again, these are all changes that will have no user visible modifications. There's no existing plugins aren't broken. No one that's using Velero needs to worry about the changes. If you pull in the new code in your plugin, there may be cases where you have used a different package name, but that's only relevant if you're actually upgrading to 110 and building your plugins on top of that. Existing plugins still work. I've tested that. I have another PR that I didn't link here, which is listed as draft, not to merge. It's a proof of concept for what a V2 backup item action would look like. I just kind of created a new method I called through that doesn't really do anything, just kind of to prove out that if you build a V2 plugin and update the backup to use V2, then you can register a V2 plugin, it works. Existing V1 plugins continue to work through the adapter. That's just kind of proving out the concept of plugin versioning. When you add a V2, you don't break existing V1 plugins. That's not to be merged as is, that's a proof of concept because it doesn't actually build out what we want for V2. This is just a test. So that's it for the plugin versioning. The volume snapshot location credentials, that PR was merged. So if you're using AWS for volume snapshots, that just works. I've tested that. We still need to add support for GCP and Azure to support credentials per volume snapshot location. It's probably not a very large PR needed there because the support when it was added to AWS was relatively small, but that's not in place yet. Ideally, we get that in pretty quickly, but that's something that could be added later too, because that's not built into Velero itself. That's built into the plugin releases.
Mm-hmm.
So the actual Velero plugin for VCP and the Velero plugin for Microsoft Azure. That's where that support would need to be built in. There's no additional change in the Velero code base needed other than what's already merged.
Thanks, Scott. I have a couple of questions. First, regarding the plugin versioning.
Yes.
I thought we discussed that we want to introduce the restore item action and backup item action v2 in 1.10. So
yeah, well, we wanted that. The problem is that what part of the design for that is in the item, you know, that item action,
progress monitoring,
and that design is not approved yet. So because we don't have an approved design yet, we weren't really able to build out and approve the, you know, the plugin changes. So that's you know, we were originally hoping to get all of that. As that item action change in 1.10.
Yeah. Okay, I see. Because yeah, that progress monitoring was not part of 1.10. So yeah, I was a little confused. So then later we decided to combine those efforts. So that will impact both the backup item action and restore item action, right? I was thinking that only impact the backup item action. I'll double check.
Well, it's actually all three of those because the updated is because for the async action, the ability to run these you know, the upload or other long-standing plugin actions, the data mover design that Shubham's been working on needs those both for backup item action and restore item action, which is why that design PR includes both backup item action, restore item action, and volume snapshotter. All three of those will need a V2 plugin API that adds that, you know, cancel method and the status method.
I see. So then after this meeting, I will double check the issues in the 1.10 milestone, and if there are any issues regarding the V2 BIA RIA plugins, I will add a comment and move them out of 1.10 because
I'd love to get them in, but again, the problem is that those are kind of tied up in the design that's not yet approved, and since we're already at feature freeze, you know, I don't know how that's gonna fit together at this point. If we get an approved design, you know, the next few days, then maybe we can start doing that and throwing that in there. But I just don't know where we are with the other design reviews. I mean, we at this point, as far as I know for sure. The one thing I know we need to add to the V2 for those plugins is the proposal from the item action plugin. I think we had another, there was another feature relating to, I believe it was just restore, but this escaped me at the moment. It's a longstanding issue from, you know, a year or so ago that I think I already had an approved design on that also will need to add to the API, but once you know that factors into the design of the V2 API, because there we say, okay, here's what we're adding, here's what we're changing, because basically, you know, the expectation at this point is that we're adding new methods and possibly adding fields to the arguments to the functions, and then because of the adapter design. We won't break existing plugins because we'll just have to, you know, because these are optional things that not every plugin needs, the adapter will just implement a no-op version of that of that function that just, you know, returns you know, without doing anything for the V1 plugins.
Yeah, I'll need to double check the PR, but per my understanding, you know, for the adapters, we can introduce them when we implement the V2.
Yeah, exactly. They're actually tied in there. And if you look at my proof of concept draft PR for the backup item action V2, you see an example of that. Those adapters are actually built in the same packages as the restartable backup item action, restartable restore item action. So basically, because they're in the same package, they basically, you know, the plugin author doesn't worry about it. You create a V1 plugin, you create a V2 plugin. You can actually register both V1 and V2 plugins in the same plugin image because they're separate functions for that. And when Velero set, you know, when for example the backup processor says, give me all the item actions, the backup item actions, it's getting a list of V2 plugins, but behind the scenes, Velero is giving it a list of all the plugins and using the adapters to take the V1 plugins and adapt them to V2. So if for a given plugin name, if there's a V2 plugin, you grab it directly. If there's not a V2 plugin, you grab the V1 plugin if it's there and you adapt it using the adapter.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah. I think that's consistent with the design.
And that's why I created that draft proof of concept PR, so you can see how it will be done, and also so I could test to make sure that, you know, once we define that V2 plugin API, all the refactoring that I've done for backup item action is the right refactoring, and the two work side by side. So that was the reason for creating that draft PR, so I could test it out to make sure it actually works.
Thanks, I'll follow that up. So I see an issue with that. When we were planning to adding the V2 plugins, we didn't consider this progress monitor in the scope.
We didn't initially consider it. Yeah, that's right. And then that's exactly what happened. When we were doing the early scoping of this, well, we didn't plan that. And in fact, the first version of the data mover async plugin design was actually a completely new plugin type. And then we decided, and then we realized, from some feedback on that proposal, that this was actually similar to Dave's original upload progress monitoring. And we realized that it made a lot more sense not to create totally brand new plugin types, but instead create a V2 of existing plugin types. And that's what happened with the V2 plan, is that we ended up adding to what we needed for V2. Now, if we have something ready for V2 that we need, we can create a V2 and then the item action progress could be V3. I mean, it's not like you have to have everything at once. If we have something ready for 110 that actually provides functionality, then we can add that. That's fine. I don't know if we're at a point where we have that defined, other than the item action progress that we need. I know Fong had one at one point relating to timeouts. I'm not sure what the status is of that, of where it's needed, and if that's something. And at this point, late in the process, if those things, I mean, I know on the kind of OAD Red Hat side, we had two things that we had in mind for the plugins. This item action progress is the main thing. And then we had another thing that's really a lower priority for us. So we're fine. If we can't get the item action stuff in time, the other stuff is also something that we're fine to wait on, because it's something that it's not a critical thing at this point. Whereas the item action stuff is more critical, because that's kind of in the critical path for getting a scalable data mover in place.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And the other thing is regarding the VSL credentials.
Yes.
So I think after this meeting, I'll create a couple of issues for GCP and Azure support for the VSL credentials. Hopefully we can have them done in 110, but from my understanding, if we do not support it, it doesn't break anything, so it's okay, right?
Yeah, exactly. Adding the credentials doesn't make the GCP and Azure any worse. Although if you try to use them, it's not going to work for you.
Okay.
But so we could always release, with that being one of the known issues, and all it takes is a plug. We don't have to even have a 110.1 to release it. We just need like a for example, if it's 1.6 is the plugin release version, we can release a 1.6.1 plugin release that includes that, and that doesn't require a whole Velero new release. So because it's in the plugin, we could possibly get that release, and I'm just saying, if we don't make the deadline for whatever version of the plugin we're releasing with 110, since it's only a plugin release, we might be able to get that out pretty quickly after that, if we miss it. And if we get it soon enough, then obviously, then we're good. But we don't need any additional code for VSL credentials and Velero itself. It's just in the plugins at this point.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks.
And again, AWS is there already. So if you're using AWS, you're good. It's only GCP and Azure that currently don't support that.
Okay. Thanks, Scott and Daniel. And let's move on. Shubham, please.
Yeah, so I got one issue regarding the timeout which we have for ensuring Rustic repository. So I think initially it was just 1 minute. So we had some scale testing done for Rustic in our environment, and for 200 namespaces using Rustic, the backup was failing partially with the error that the ensure repo timeout is getting exceeded. So I just wanted to bring this issue to attention and I've even posted a PR to increase the timeout to like 5 minutes. So 5 minutes worked for us, and we want to make this configurable in like next versions of Velero, and keep the and increase the timeout, like give the user the choice to increase the timeout. So what do you guys think about this?
Yeah, and the issue is that the assumption is that the rest of the repository will be ready quickly, because you know, when you're just doing one namespace or 10 namespaces, it doesn't take very long. And so whoever wrote this original code was like, okay, a minute should be plenty of time. But the problem is when you scale this up, and if you're doing a backup with a bunch of namespaces, you know, it might take a minute and a half, 2 minutes, 3 minutes instead of less than 1 minute. And so then your backups are just failing on you because of that. So, you know, in the short term, just bumping it up to 5 minutes seems to make sense as a default. But if we eventually make it configurable, then someone can, if they say they don't want 5 minutes, they can go back to 1, or they can make it 10 if they need to, because they have 1,000 namespaces or whatever. Yeah. But I think just changing the default to something larger than a minute is kind of the quick fix that makes it work for now. And then longer term, we can add the configurability with another parameter.
So it means, okay. It means for we have many namespaces, so we will connect or run the REST command to connect to the repository for many times. This is where we need a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and really this shouldn't change the time for the backup, because this is just how long you wait before we give up an error out. So if things are working right, increasing the timeout. So I guess there's a couple of cases. In the case where it's already working, increasing the timeout won't affect you because you're already, you know, REST repositories already found before the timeouts hit. So you don't even notice the difference. If it's taking longer than a minute but less than 5 minutes, then increasing the timeout is the difference between a failed backup and a successful backup, which is what we're accomplishing here. If it's taking more than 5 minutes, this PR won't affect you. But in the case where repositories are failing, like it really is not ready because there's a problem, the 5 minute timeout means it'll take you, 4 minutes longer to time out if there is a problem. But again, in terms of a percentage of how long the overall backup takes, I think that's a good trade-off versus failing backups when everything's working fine. But we do eventually want to make this configurable, because, eventually someone's going to increase the number of namespaces, or they're working on a cluster that's overloaded and slow, and maybe it takes 6 minutes instead of 5, and this fails again. So if it's configurable, if they know they have a slow cluster, they know they're making a huge backup, they can just change the setting, the backup, the timeout setting. But I think as a default, especially with non-configurable default, 1 minute is just too small. It's not going to scale. It doesn't. In our case, it was working fine for 100 namespaces and failing for 200. And these are just test namespaces with I think it was just one volume per namespace. So, if you had a larger backup that had more going on per namespace, that this might be hit even earlier. I'm not sure what the cutoff is, what the cause is. I just know that when we create 200 at once and then wait for them to be ready, a minute may not be enough time. In fact, it probably won't be enough time if you have more than,
So 100 was not the exact number, but yeah, it worked successfully for a minute.
Right, it was working fine for 100 and it was failing at 200, and somewhere in between there is where it started failing. We don't know exactly where, because
Exactly.
I still didn't get the problem. Here we have actually created one repo and wait for one repo, right? Well, why it has something to do with the amount of the repos we are going to create. Because we create one repo here and then we wait for that repo. And it should not have anything to do with the count of the repo or related to the other repos.
Aren't we creating a repo for all the volumes?
I mean, so Shiva, when this is run, I mean, I know we're creating a channel and waiting. So that's all done in the background, right? I mean, I think so these are being done in parallel. Is that the case? The repository ensure?
That's what I thought.
I had the impression that these were running in, each of these threads was running in parallel, and so if you're doing a bunch of, if you're creating a bunch of repositories, then, because we're creating a channel and then, waiting for this to happen in the background. I mean, I'm not sure. It may be that we're doing one at a time here, but I just know that in the test environment, as the number of namespaces increases, and it may be that it's just being slower because, the queries, when you're iterating over, if there's 200 REST repositories versus if there's only 100, it's taking longer because of that. In other words, the cluster itself, when you're creating and you're updating, I don't know if just with the number of these in the namespace increases, if that's having a performance impact.
But how many worker nodes are there when you're doing the scale test?
I'm not sure. Do you know?
No, I'm not sure about the worker nodes. I can get back the number to you guys if you want tomorrow.
Yeah. I think Yonghui raised some valid doubt, but it seems that there is a lock added to the file system, right? When you check ensuring the repo. I'm not quite familiar with that piece of code, but I had this impression. Yonghui.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely getting the timed out waiting for REST repository to become ready log message. That was how we knew it was in this code that it was causing the problem, because we provided a modified image to the scale testing team to time out in 5 minutes instead of 1 minute, and the errors went away. I mean, this is again why I think ultimately we wanted this to be configurable, so that if in particular environments it's failing, then we can have those users increase this number for just them based on that. But without it being configurable, and maybe 5 minutes is not the right answer, but something larger than 1 minute, because I mean 1 minute is kind of this arbitrary thing of, oh, this should be fast, so let's call it a minute. And the problem is that it's that number was not kind of developed as a result of testing real world environments. It was just, hey, it looks pretty fast in my environment, it's taking a few seconds, let's wait a minute. It could have waited 2 minutes or could have been 3 minutes, but it was 1 minute. And it just doesn't seem to work in environments with more
so it makes
Yonghui, I think we should also double check the code, right? I also don't think the time should be longer or linear along with the number of repos or namespaces. So we should find the root cause for this.
Yeah, I think I also agree that we need to further check this to get the root cause. But and Daniel, what you said just now may be some reason that is for the repo creating. Actually, we call the REST list snapshot command. The list snapshot command, if I remember, it acquires exclusive lock that will make all the repo connection to be sequential, right? That may be the reason, but I'm not 100% sure for right now. And another thing is if we enlarge the time, and one impact is if the repo creation, for example, have some problem, and I mean the worst case, we will wait for that long time. Right? I think that will be the impact.
Mm-hmm. So,
in cases where it's not working at all, then a larger timeout will then take you longer to get the error added to the backup.
Yeah, so Shubao, you need to reach the scale goal in 110, right? You need to make sure that's successful for 200 namespaces.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, we eventually we may probably fix. I mean, for 110, we may probably merge this PR to increase the timeout, but I would suggest we dig a little deeper to understand why it fails.
Oh yeah,
Maybe there's some
if
issue in the
we can
design.
find the root cause where you know, things are being slower with more namespaces than it shouldn't be because of there's some inefficiency, you know, or some place where we're getting locked, we don't need it. I mean, that would be a better solution. And then we could, you know, if we found that, we might be able to get, you know, then reduce that timeout again. If we found a definite, oh, this is why it's taking longer for 200 namespaces and it shouldn't be. And this other code change, you know, somewhere else makes that difference, whether it has to do with locks or it has to do with, you know, trying to do things in parallel, I'm not sure. But if we can identify, you know, a bottleneck somewhere that actually makes things go faster, you know, making it go faster is better than increasing a timeout. But at the same time, what we don't want to do, and this is just like with the restic timeout where that's configurable, you know, if there are cases where it's taking longer for a restic backup, then we need to increase that timeout, because what we don't want is to report to the user, hey, your backup failed because it took too long, even though it would have finished if we'd given it a little more time.
Okay. Another thing is, if it's really related to the REST log problem, actually for Copia, we don't have that log. So maybe we can try the Copia path sometime and to make a comparison to see if it is related to the REST or related to the API server, right? That may be some way to troubleshoot. And another thing is we have refactored the repo insurer several days ago. So maybe if we want to do the change, we need to refer to the new code.
Yeah.
So you are doing this
new code.
So you were doing the scale test on the recompiled code on main branch?
No, we were using 191.
Yeah, 191.
Okay.
Yeah. Generally, when we're doing scale testing, we're gonna, you know, for the most part, we're using the most recent release.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's kind of, you know, showing what customers are seeing right now. And then, you know, when we hit issues, if we identify, oh, this is a problem that's been fixed in, you know, main, then we can try to go down that path. And we didn't see any obvious way that, you know, main has fixed it. But, you know, since it's been refactored, it may well be possible that the refactoring changed the dynamics there. So yeah, I mean, Shubham, it may be worth repeating this test with the version on, you know, the sort of version on main.
So I would suggest we spend a little more time to find out the root cause before merging this PR. You guys are okay with that, right? Or you want to merge the PR first and find the root cause?
Can we get this PR for 192? Is it possible?
I think, yeah, I think it's probably okay to have this for 192. And
yeah, so because after Copia integration, the code is changing. So
yeah.
It would be okay, right, Scott? Our 1.1.1 will be based off 192, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is something we'd probably want. I mean, we'd probably want in 192 anyway, just because, like you said, if this is a problem in the existing 191, you know, people are going to be using 192 before they're using 110. So, you know, getting it in 192 means also we then need to figure out before we release 110, do we also need it in 110, or does it not need it anymore because of the refactoring? But you know, because this is you know, essentially a bug fix, not a new feature. This is something that, you know, we can, you know, as long as it's before code freeze, we have a little more time to work through. You know, do we just want this? And the answer may be we just need to make the same change in 110. Or the answer may be, oh, we don't need this anymore because we've done some scale testing with, you know, the pre-release, you know, code as of feature freeze, and then it's fine. So we just need to find the right time where, okay, we're not refactoring Copia stuff anymore, you know, whether that's the end of this week or whatever. And at that point, get a build for the people who are doing scale work, and you know, let's use that instead of you know, which would essentially be doing some kind of scale work based on what's going to be in the OADP in a 1.2 release rather than the 1.1, because that's going to be, you know, so that will help us know whether we need this for 110 as well. And at the same time, if we can see something in that refactored code where it's, you know, a different place where we can fix some bottleneck that's causing things to take longer, that would also solve the problem in a different way.
Yeah. I think the PR Shubang submitted, it's a quick fix and that works. So it seems a reasonable fix for 192 because we found the root cause and a better change in the locking mechanism. We are not going to make that change in 19 probably. So
right, exactly.
Yeah. So Shubang, will you mind create another PR to change it to
no
19?
problem. Yeah. I'll do a release 19 branch PR.
Yeah, Ming, as you are preparing for the 192, I assume that's okay, right?
Okay.
To have this one? Yeah, just keep an eye on. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, we come to the discussion topics, and the first one is the first two ones from me is like some rename work. Actually, we have discussed a little about this during the Unified Repo Design PR, right? So here, specifically, we want to rename the RASIC daemon set to the Velero node agent daemon set. That is just for proposal. So if any parts or anyone has some concerns, we can just raise them out, and it's still on the early stage.
Yeah, so I would say I like Velero node agent. I think that works well because I think default to pod volumes is confusing because to a user, they're not thinking in terms of pod volumes. They're thinking of, I want it. I mean, because RESTIC is a, file system copy versus a snapshot copy. So I wonder if we want to say default to file system copy or something like that, because pod volume is just an internal thing that we use in Velero to use RESTIC or Copia. It's not something that a user thinks about, because pod volume is just to have a pod to have a volume. But you have those two things even if you're doing snapshots. But if you say default to file system backup, that's what both RESTIC and Copia are. They're file system level backup solutions.
Yeah.
So what's your suggestion? Yeah. So what's your suggestion for the naming?
So I'm suggesting instead of default to pod volumes, default to file system backup, or something like that.
Default. Wait a minute. Default to file
system backup. Yeah, just one word for file system, but
okay.
So no dash between file and system, but otherwise.
The thing here is like, when we have the data mover for CSI, if we move the data from the file system level, it's still a file system backup, right?
It's still. I mean, we do a CSI volume.
But
yeah, you're right. At some level, we are doing a file system backup because. That's not a perfect word either.
But in that case, Yonghui, I would argue you're not using this option to control the flow you just mentioned.
Right.
Because
this
is
an
one
option to say, hey,
yeah.
Because basically there's one switch, which is do we use something in Velero, using the node agent to copy the file, the content of the file system directly by Velero, and that's what we're calling default volumes to RESTIC, for example, in the current 19. And if you don't do that, then what you're doing is either CSI snapshots or native volume snapshotter. And then whether so that's
I think it's okay to rename it to default to file system volume file system backup if that sounds better, because we are not using this term in the CSI snapshot data mover scenario.
Right.
In that scenario, we will add some attribute to the data mover CR or somewhere to define that. So that's a different option.
Yeah, right. So, because at the Velero level, what data mover does is sort of, I mean, this is more what Velero does in the backup and restore process. And at that level, Velero doesn't care about data mover. Velero's, we're using CSI or we're using volume snapshot or we're, using some plugin to do this. Versus we use this file system backup, which means using the Velero node agent to perform the copy.
Yeah, because at present the default volume to RESTIC means default to pod volume backup, right? default pod volume backup. So if we change it to default to file system backup, there is not any indication that it is for pod volume backup, even though we know that for CSI data mover, we don't use that, but from the name or from the user's impression.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's another suggestion that might work that may make the connection clear. Since we're renaming the Restic pod to Velero node agent, we could also say default volumes to node agent, saying we're going to use the node agent to make the copies. So and I would keep the first part default volumes too. So the
volume.
Basically just replacing Restic with node agent in the name. That would also work.
But Yonghui, I think the reason you raised the concern still confused me a little bit, because if we use default volume to file system backup and we use CSI with data mover, what's the problem? I mean, that option doesn't impact the workflow of the data mover at all.
Right. When you're using data mover, you're using the CSI plugin, and so you're not doing this. And we're still making that decision. Velero is saying, hey, are we going to use the node agent to copy the file system directly, or are we going to not do that, and instead we're going to let the CSI plugin do what it needs to do, and then everything in terms of data mover to using the volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents from the CSI plugin. Velero itself doesn't worry about any of those details. It just invokes a plugin. It's a backup item action plugin. It's a restore item action plugin. Everything else that happens with data mover is something that's plugin kind of centric.
Yeah, I agree that underlying in our code part it is totally different. But from user's impression, we can also say that the pod volume backup is also something like a data mover, right? It is backing up using the file system way to back up data. And the CSI data mover is also using the file system way to back up the data. So I'm trying to answer Daniel's the question. For me, that this file system level backup cannot represent the pod volume backup. That is.
It does not. I mean, if we change it to default to file system backup, it does not represent the pod volume backup. We can set this default volume to file system backup to false and still use the CSI and data mover.
Right. I mean, this isn't really representing either one directly. This is basically just how you tell Velero what does Velero normally do if there's not an annotation. It's just because it's a flag. And so I guess I'm just trying to think in terms of what is the user going to think about. If a user says, hey, I want to use CSI, or I want to use volume snapshot, or that's the default, that if you don't set this, what is the user going to think about it? Hey, I want to use Scopy, I want to use Restic. When we only had Restic, it was easy. I want to use Restic. That's what the user would think, and so they would put that in there. Node agent, file system, either one of these, and a lot of this is just what we document. As long as we document, if you use this flag, this is what happens, and we just need to make sure that whatever term we use here is integrated into the documents. When we talk about the opt-in versus the opt-out way of making these decisions.
So I think, Scott, you think both? Either of default file system backup or default to node agent is better than default to pod volume, right?
And the only reason I'm thinking that is, again, I'm just thinking as a user, I'm not thinking pod volume backup is kind of an internal Velero CR that we use to kind of hold information internally that the users aren't really working with directly. The user's thinking, hey, I want to use Scopy, hey, I want to use Restic. Hey, I want to use CSI.
Yeah, I see. Yeah,
and that's so kind of my thinking is that, I'm trying to figure out what would be the clearest to the user. Pod volume backup is not something that, you specify anywhere in the backup CR and the annotations. You're talking about, well, I guess there's another question, and I just don't remember. Like right now, in 1.9, when the user is using restic, they have the annotation that says restic volumes. What are we calling that annotation in 1.10? The pod annotation.
You mean?
It's not used. It does not have restic in the annotation.
No, I know it doesn't. I know that's what I'm saying. We changed it. You know, in 1.9 it was restic volumes. I just don't remember off the top of my head what we're calling it in 1.10.
In 1.9 it's not restic volume.
Is it?
You mean the opt-in, opt-out annotation, right?
The annotation where we say, hey, I want to use restic. I thought it was restic volumes.
It does not have restic in the.
What is the name of the annotation in 1.10?
I mean, even in 1.9, it's let me check.
Yeah, I think that name, that annotation is a generic name.
Right.
So
right.
So we have we don't want to change that.
No, yeah, if it's already generic, then so yeah, that's fine. I guess I didn't remember what that annotation was called. I guess at this point. So if that's generic, that.
Yeah, maybe when we have more data movers like CSI data movement, data mover, we will reuse that value for many purposes. But currently, it is only used by the pod volume backup. So we didn't want to change that.
Yeah, currently the name is backup volumes. It does not have restic in the name.
Oh, okay. Then that's not. Yeah, okay. I was just trying to. I'm trying to think in terms of what a user is currently specifying around restic and how that changes.
I see.
You know, so.
Yeah, I think as for the concern by Yonghui, I think Yonghui, we can take it offline and later make decision whether we want to use file system copy or file system backup or node agent.
Can you guys do a short form of file system like default volumes to FS backup or FS copy?
Oh yeah, make that shorter.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can make it shorter and we'll consider the node agent backup or the file system and make a decision later. Let you guys know.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me just add one more thing. It's like for this one, why do we change the daemon set to node agent? We want to make the daemon set generic for generic purpose, not only for pod volume backup in future. So if we call it default volume to node agent, it's like it means whatever node agent functionality, whatever functionality the node agent provides, we will use that for the volume backup by default. That may be some some problem.
Okay.
So that's why I prefer the file system stuff.
Okay. I mean, node agent, the node agents, it sounds like it might be more generic than where we are now in the future. It's still only going to be used for things that, you know, it has to be on a specific node, because that's why we use it for restic and for Copia is because, you know, we need to be on the same node as the pod that mounts the volume. And so the node matters, you know, any generic functionality where the node is not relevant would be something we'd probably put in the regular Velero pod. You know, the things you're going to put in the node agent pod are things that you know, need to run on a specific node based on where a pod is running or where a volume is mounted, which right now is just restic and Copia. But you know, if there is future functionality that also is node dependent, that could go there as well.
Okay, yeah, but we already clear of this too. We will discuss this offline, and we can. And the final one that is maybe we can make it to live file system backup. That will be clear to me, but I'm not sure for others but let's discuss this offline because we have run out of time. This one is like something we have found during the refactoring. So it's like we have two ways to get the snapshot for the restore. Actually, the first way is we get it. This is the current way. We get it from the pod PVB status, right? Like here. And actually, after that, if we don't if we don't find that, we will fall back to this function. And like here, we found the snapshot ID from the port annotation. And this way is a deprecated way. And we have actually added this this deprecation message in a very old release. So since we are doing refactory here right now, so we want to just remove the old way. So we want to see if there is any concern from any part. If not, we will remove that. But maybe we cannot make a conclusion here. And right now, we can, if so, we can leave some message here. I'm not sure if any, yeah, Scott,
I think that's a
Shubham.
good idea as long as everything works. I mean, obviously we need testing to make sure that, you know, removing this doesn't break anything, but this seems like exactly the thing we should have probably removed, you know, several releases ago. And like you said, since we're totally refactoring this, removing something long deprecated, this is the perfect time to do it. Otherwise, you're going to have to build in snapshot ID, you know, annotations in new functionality for Copia, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it seems in history there was a 1.0 backup format. Then later in 1.0 in Velero 1.0, they are using the backup format 1.1. So if we remove this deprecated method, that means Velero will no longer work with 1.0 format backup. But I think that's okay because that has to be very old.
Well, it also, and I may be misunderstanding this, it sounds like if we're already using the status field for this, even an old Velero backup, you know, if we're setting both of them, then we're fine. It's only, you know, a backup old enough to only use the annotations, because I guess at one point we used annotations and then we added the status field, but we kept the annotation support
Right.
because you might have old backups.
Right.
So, you know, the point is that I don't think, I mean, I don't know what version of Velero was the latest one that didn't have, you know, they didn't have the status field. I'm guessing it's Velero 0.9 or something before
Right.
1.
Right.
I don't think we still support Velero 0.9 backups in 1.10. So I don't think removing the deprecated code, I mean, that's the reason we deprecate, because when you deprecate something, you say, okay, at some future release, you know, at least say 1 release from now or 2 releases from now, we're going to remove this. So, you know, we don't have to rely on it forever because of that.
Yeah, Yonghui, I think we can send a message in the Velero dev and Velero users to notify this. If there's no disagreement, no concern, we just remove it in 1.10. I don't, yeah.
Was this because we stripped down the status of PVVs and CRs, and that's why we add annotations? Or like,
and then the annotations was the older one. It's
right.
actually the annotation that's the deprecated one.
Okay.
So I think what this means is that at some point, although we can probably follow back and look at that PR, but it sounds like, you know, a very old version of Velero 2 or 3 years ago, we started the first version of this used annotations, and then
Right.
someone decided we want this in status instead of relying on annotations for this. So we added the status and deprecated the annotation version of it.
Yeah.
So in Velero 1.0, we had the deprecated annotations and we're using status with the expectation that, say, maybe Velero 1.2 or 1.3 would remove it completely, but then we never got around to removing it.
So
Okay.
you guys don't have any concern removing it, right? Shubham and Scott? No.
I mean, I think one thing you want to test as part of this is do a backup on Velero 1.9 or 1.8. Let's say 1.9 because this code didn't change between them. If a 1.9 backup with Restic will restore on 1.10 without this annotation code, I think that's probably good enough to say, you know, we're good. Because what I suspect is the case is the only backup you're breaking by removing this is from Velero 0.9 or whatever release was before we added the status.
Oh, actually, the code for adding that annotation has been removed a long time ago. So currently, we only have the getting.
Right.
The code
right. So we're not creating annotations. So right. So basically, the only time the annotation is going to matter is if you are
from
storing a
backup.
backup that was created in a version of Velero before we added the status.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know if we have a published list somewhere. We probably should if we don't, of what versions of Velero backups. In other words, if I back up with Velero 1.9, I expect 1.10 we'll be able to restore that backup. I probably expect that a 1.7 backup will work with 1.10. I probably don't expect a 1.0 backup will work with 1.10, but I don't know that we've published in the document, in the docs, what the user should expect there.
Okay. So
currently we do not have this official message saying that latest Velero will only support like n minus how many versions backup. But
right.
I think for this particular case, I think we are relatively safe to remove that. As Yunhui just mentioned, the code that was adding the annotation in the backup was removed in a very early version, right?
And that's what I'm saying, that we know that a user should expect that a 1.7 or a 1.8 or a 1.9 backup will still work with Velero 1.10. We don't expect a 1.0 backup to still work with 1.9. I don't know where that cutoff should be, but I think the version where this was added was old enough that I think at this point, because especially since we've deprecated it, several versions ago, I think at this point this should be safe to remove.
But that cutoff, right? I mean, that should be a big number, though. I mean, because customers do archive, they retain backups for multiple years.
That's what I'm saying. I would expect a 1.7 or a 1.8 or a 1.9 backup should work with 1.10. I don't think a 1.0 backup should work necessarily. But I don't know what the reasonable expectation is, and we haven't documented what that expectation. What we haven't told users what to expect. So every user has their own expectation in their head right now, saying what I think, what they think is reasonable. We probably should start publishing that at some point, but that requires testing to see, what actually works. I mean, But that cross version thing is especially relevant when we release a new version of Velero that removes support for older Kubernetes versions. Because if you have a case where I have a backup from a cluster that can't use the latest Velero and I want to restore that in a newer cluster, that's where the cross version backup and restore is actually most relevant. And that's where having some kind of documentation around expectations would be helpful. But yeah, in this particular case, we're talking about, Velero 1.0 versus 1.10. I mean, that's a, probably 3-year time, scale. And this has been, once you deprecate something, you're saying, we're probably going to be removing this in a couple of releases, and it's been many more than that. So I think at this point, we're well beyond the point where we need to keep this.
Yeah, looks like this is a generic question for Velero to remove some deprecations, right? So maybe we add it in the release note or something like that before. Or after
we definitely need to. If you're removing something that was deprecated, you definitely need to add, the release notes to mention that clearly, and not embedded into the list of changes. Somewhere fairly prominent. And we should be clear before we do that. Let's look it up to see what Velero version, added the status, so we can say for sure this is only relevant for backups, older than this version. Just to be clear.
Yeah, maybe we can continue the discussion in the Slack channel, and we will make a decision. We add that to the release note. If we don't remove it in the current, in V 1.10, we can add some thing in the release note that we will deprecate in the next release, something like that.
I think it's okay for this case we remove it. A follow-up item is we decide, how early the version we should support officially. I'm writing up an issue to track that, but for this case, I don't think anyone disagree that we remove it.
Okay. 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 Sorry that we have. But let's continue to finish. Try to finish them. And the next one is Xun, please. Xun.
Okay. So can I share the screen?
Okay.
I created this proposal is to separate the resource filter parameter, that is the include resources and exclude resources parameter, and separate into cluster scope and the namespace scope. But by current release 1.10, I think the existing include resources and exclude resources will still function as the old behavior and may be changed in future releases. By far, that's the main idea of this proposal. And I created this because the resources is separated into the cluster scope and the namespace scope. And for the include, especially for the include resource parameter, it means we're only including the resource type specified. So it will be hard to implement to include specified resources in one group, for example, the cluster scope, and include all resources in another group, for example, the namespace scope. So that's why I propose this separating. And I think there are some comments from Scott. And I think the main idea of the Scott comments it's hard to replace the include cluster resource parameter because it has 3 values and it has different meanings. So
right, yeah. Basically, I guess what I'm saying is that we're adding new fields first, and these new fields are listing specific resource types to include or exclude. We still need that Boolean pointer field because one of the ways that we use the Boolean field is, right now if we set it to true, that includes everything. And I think the everything then could be filtered and modified by these new fields. Likewise, if you set it to false, again, you're saying you don't want anything. The thing that you can't reproduce, the include everything versus exclude everything, the new flags, if we added them, could cover that. But what they don't cover is that default case, the auto case, where we have this where it's set to auto, and that allows us to do things like only include PVs, when the PVC that it's linked to is backed up, or only include CRDs when we have a CR for that type that's backed up. And so we don't want to lose that functionality with this change. But I think it's fine. I just think that that existing Boolean pointer field needs to exist simultaneously with these new fields, and we need to be clear in the way we name them as to what their function is. In other words, that Boolean include cluster scope, if you set it to true, that kind of enables the new parameters to say, okay, if we include everything, these include excludes, then let us filter down which ones we actually mean. We don't really want every single thing. We just want to enable us to include everything subject to those filters. Whereas if you set it to false, you're saying ignore cluster scope entirely. I don't want anything cluster scoped. And then again, that auto case is where you only want to include certain things. But again, you can use that certain things to be filtered. But so in other words, that Boolean kind of gives overall behavior that I think we want to preserve. But these fields here are really just replacing because right now we have the single list, include cluster scopes, include resources and exclude resources. And I think the intent here, as I understand it, is to still do the same thing, but in two categories instead of in one category. So I think as long as we preserve the behavior of the existing Boolean field, I think we're good there. And the other comment I had there was, again, because right now include resources where everything's together. If you don't specify it, then the default is you include everything. So it might be better to do the same thing with the include cluster. I'm not sure, or maybe because it's a new parameter, we can change that and say you have to specify star if you want everything included.
Yes, that is my thought. I added something in the comments.
Right.
If empty, it means no additional cluster scope resource included.
Okay. And the only thing is that I don't know if that's going to be confusing because it's a different behavior from the other one.
Yeah, right.
But that's just one thing we should figure out. The other thing I wonder about is what happens if you set that to, like what if a user puts a cluster scope resource in the include resources, or if they put a namespace resource in the cluster one? Would that just be a validation error? That might make sense. But again, in terms of backwards compatibility, I wonder, because if you have an old backup that format, it mixes those in the one field.
Yeah, Shun, I think we used, when we discussed this earlier, we used to think we also should introduce another set of parameters to include and exclude namespace scope resources. So we use this include cluster scope resources only in combination with the include namespace resources.
Oh, so in other words, keep the existing one working the way it does. And this is kind of analogous. Remember when we added for 1.9, we added the OR label selector, and then we have validation to say either use the new way or the old way. The old way works the same way the old way did before. The new way is a different rules, and we enforce the user as one or the other. And so we can do the same here. We have include and exclude resources. The old parameters use the old rules, and then we have a validation rule that says you either use the old ones or the new ones, not both. And then you have include cluster scope resources and include namespace resources, exclude cluster scope resources and exclude namespace resources. That makes it clear that we don't reuse the same include resources and changes meaning.
Right.
Yeah, that would actually probably be better. And I would say too, then we can also make the meaning of the wildcard versus, leaving it alone. We can make those consistent. You could say if you're using, include namespace and include cluster scope resources, you have to put the wildcard in there if you mean to include everything. Otherwise, it includes nothing. Otherwise, it makes it harder to do one of those rules. Like one of the use cases here is I want to include all cluster scoped and no namespace resources. If the rules for these new fields are to include all you need star and empty is empty, then those two are consistent. Otherwise, it's confusing if I think the namespace and the cluster scoped fields behave differently.
Right.
But yeah, yes, I think Daniel's suggestion there of make two sets of new fields and don't reuse the old include resources and exclude resources. That's going to be clearer, I think, to users. And then we can have a validation rule that says either use the new fields or the old fields. You can't use both sets of fields.
Okay.
That way, if you're creating your backup from a YAML template that worked before, use it again. It's not suddenly changing on you, and behavior around cluster scope doesn't mess you up. Whatever worked before will work now exactly the same way. But if you choose to make use of the new functionality, then you would remove those include resources and exclude resources fields from your backup template, and instead you would add the new ones. So instead of adding 2 new fields, we add 4 new fields here.
Right.
Okay. I have another thing to talk about. It's about the values of the include cluster resource. I'm okay with your proposal for the for current release, But how about to move the same logic for the three values into the include cluster scope resources in future releases and deprecate the include cluster resource parameter?
I guess I'm not sure how you would do that because they include cluster scope resources is just a list of resource types. You know, how do you distinguish between I want to include all PVs, you know, all persistent volumes in the cluster versus I want to include just those that have PVCs bound. Right now we use that nil value, kind of the auto value, to make that distinction. So that's why I'm still thinking this makes sense as a separate Boolean, because this is not providing a list to the user or to Velero. This is kind of toggling behavior. It's saying, you know, I want to include cluster scope resources by default, and then the list will tell you which ones. Or I want auto, which means I only want to include certain ones that are relevant, but you can still, again, use the list to further refine that. And then the final category is I set to false. It means I don't care what the lists say, no cluster scope resources are included here. So that's kind of a top level configuration. And I don't really think you can include that logic, especially around the kind of auto logic of including certain things, because you're including some PVs, but not others. You're including some CRDs, but not others. And there's really no way of, you know, doing that in just a list of resources. So I think it'll be a lot more confusing if we try to remove it out, you know, that way. I think we just leave that logic the way it is now, because it really doesn't interfere with the new stuff. Because if you look at the Velero code and where it's used, you know, right now, if you said include cluster resources to true, for example, it doesn't really include every cluster resource, you know, every cluster scope resource in the cluster. It includes those subject to the other selection rules. So for example, if you say include cluster resources is true, but you put PVs and exclude resources, then they're excluded. So, you know, we still use the filtering logic to determine which resources are included and which ones are excluded. But then we use that Boolean pointer as a further toggle to say, if it's true, then, you know, basically everything's included, subject to the other, you know, for example, also you could, if you said include cluster resources true, but you said a label selector, well, that means only cluster scope resources with that label selector are used. So again, this is a separate way of, and I think it's the primary use of this is to let users set it to nil to say, I only want to bring in those cluster scope resources that relate to my backup, because, you know, a namespace backup, for example, that says, hey, I just want to back up this one namespace. If I have volume data, I need those PVs. If I have CRDs, I need those. And so there's certain cluster things, cluster resources that, you know, plugins can pull in or Velero can pull in if it's a PV. And we use that field being set to auto or nil to tell Velero, hey, we want to do this. Mm-hmm. So I think we still need that.
Yeah, that's the more common usage.
But I think everything else in the proposal, I think with the change to add 4 new fields instead of 2, I think works, because basically you're basically providing a drop-in replacement instead of because what the include exclude resources does is it provides essentially it you know, the Velero include exclude logic takes those 2 lists and generates a list essentially of all the resource types in the cluster filtered by that. So, you know, if you say include everything but PVs, then you get a list of everything except PVs there. Or if you say only include certain types, then you only get those types there. And so this set of 2 lists for cluster scoped and namespace will do the same thing, but in 2 categories. The end result is that when the Velero backup code says, hey, you know, resource.should include, and then you pass in the selector, that follows down that logic. And if includes excludes is listed, you know, the legacy functionality, then it just looks at those 2 full flat lists. And if the namespace versus you know, namespace versus cluster scope resources, you know, 2 separate lists are provided, then basically Velero would, that function would say, if this is a namespace resource, look in the namespace list to determine whether it's included. If it's a cluster scope, look in the cluster list if it's included. So that isolates the change to just that kind of should include utility function. everything else about the backup and restore logic around pulling in PVs versus not, include cluster resources, true versus false versus auto, that logic is unchanged. This PR, with the implementation PR for this, won't need to change that. It just needs to add the validation for the new fields, define the new fields, and in that includes excludes package, where we have the logic to say, you pass in a resource and say, hey, should I include this? It looks at resource type, the resource itself, and compares those lists, new or old, depending on which one they specify. It looks at label selectors if it needs to. It looks at namespaces if it needs to, and all that's isolated to that one area. And we don't really need to worry about this functionality outside of that limited area of, specifying it in the CR and in that logic.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Then I have no other things to communicate.
Okay. Okay. Wait a minute. Let's move on. So the next one is from Shubham.
Yeah. So this is something which we had from one of our customers. So have you guys ever tested CSI Snapshot's workflow with label selectors?
Label selector on what resource?
On persistent volumes backup, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of gets at what we were talking about before with the functionality around, the various ways that Velero provides a user to limit what's in the backup or specify what's in the backup. If you have a label selector for a backup, then only those resources that match the label selector get backed up.
Right, but this label is for what resources in the backup? Is that on the PVC or is that on the pod?
On everything. I mean, if you specify a label selector for a backup, then Velero will only back up resources that match that label selector.
But that won't apply to the PVCs, I believe.
It should apply to everything.
Because there is assumption that, for example, if I have a label XYZ that matches one pod and the pod has 3 PVCs, only one of them has the XYZ label, but Velero will back up with all 3 PVCs. This design is based on the assumption that for the pod to start, I need all the PVC.
Have we tested? Has that been tested? I'm just, and is it just? I guess what I'm wondering about is the case we ran into wasn't so much that, because the customer did label the PVCs. The issue we ran into is that the problem is that the CSI plugin creates resources because the backup out of action, the CSI plugin creates, because it creates volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents, but it doesn't put labels on those. So if I have a backup, if I'm doing a backup and I'm saying label selector has to say, my label equals XYZ, it's only going to back up things that match that. But then we create these pod volume snapshot and volume snapshot contents. We don't create a label for those that match the label selector, which means when we return those as additional items in the plugin, Velero then calls backup item on those items. And the first thing Velero does in backup item is it checks, should this be included in the backup? We call that includes, excludes, that should include. I think that's the name of the function, which goes and checks, is this namespace included? Is this resource excluded or included? Which is affected by the previous topic, but also does the label, is there a label selector here that would exclude it?
I see. This is not, I don't think we explicitly tested it in earlier 1.9 development cycle. Would you mind writing up an issue for us to follow up?
Yeah.
Did you, Siobhan, did you create one yet or not on that?
No, I haven't. I will add the backup CRs as well, which won't work.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't verified this myself, but from seeing what Shubham saw talking to a customer and also looking at the code, I'm pretty sure the only way we can fix this is to have the CSI plugin, when it creates volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents, it needs to look at the label selector if there is one for the backup. And if there is, it needs to add a label to those items it creates that match the label selector for the backup. Actually, Shubham, it might be easier than I was thinking. Originally, I was saying, hey, we need to set the labels based on the backup labels. Like we may be able to just copy the labels that are on the PV. Although that to Daniel's point, those may not be enforced. We can check that. But the point is, there might be a relatively easy way to fix this, to pick a label that we know will match. If we can look at the pod label or the PV label or something, I just don't know for sure. I think the PV for CSI does need the label because that doesn't depend on a pod. But in any case, once we create the issue, we can look into figuring out those edge cases.
Yeah, because
we either need to grab labels from the PVC, which might be the easiest way to fix it, or we need to look at the backup CR, and that might be more complicated. But if we can grab the labels from the PVC, that might be a pretty easy fix to the problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because
my only concern, I also want to double check the code, but I think whatever was returned by the backup item action, Velero should make sure to include it, disregarding if it has label or not.
No,
if it doesn't work.
No, the problem with that is that Velero, that
won't execute.
When a user creates Velero backup, Velero is very strict about, for example, if there's a resource that we add to exclude resources and say, hey, I don't want to, back up this particular resource, then Velero will never back that up, because every time we get to backup item, it checks, hey, this is excluded. And so we log a message saying this is excluded, and we go on. And if plugins can get around that by adding additional items that are excluded, I think that kind of breaks the contract where we're telling Velero this is the selection criteria. But I think it makes sense, especially with the CSI plugin, because we're creating volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents based on a PV. I think it's reasonable for that plugin to add labels to those things it creates that match the labels that are on the PV it's creating them from. If I have a label in a PV that says, app name is Velero, it makes sense to create a volume snapshot and volume snapshot content with that same label. And I think that will fix the problem too.
Yeah, that's a valid fix. Yeah, but we are talking a problem from different perspective, right? So Shubham, let's write up an issue and we can continue the discussion there.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah,
but fix PR.
Yeah, because Shubham, I think if you set a label based on the PV, I think that'll solve everything without having to do anything complicated in Velero like I was originally thinking we'd have to do. But then the fix is only in the PV, only in the plugin, and there's no Velero changes needed for that. I mean, you should test it to see, but I think that'll actually be an easier fix than I originally thought.
But we can always fetch backup labels inside the plugin code, right?
Well, it's not backup labels you need. The problem is that a label selector could be more complicated.
Specified in the backup CR spec, I mean.
But in the backup CR spec, user may include different labels, right?
Right. The backup CR could have multiple labels because we have that or label selectors thing, or it could be a label selector that says this label's values in this list. So label selectors have a fairly complicated, set of ways you can create them. I think if we just clone the labels from the PVC, because this is the PVC item action, right? Where we create the it's either PVC or PV, I forget which one, but basically there's an item action on the PVC, for example. I think that's what it's on.
Yeah.
And there we create that volume snapshot resource.
Yeah. Yep.
We already have the PV right there, the PVC. It's clearly, whatever labels it has are sufficient to be included in the backup, or we wouldn't be running this code. Let's just use those labels, because that also makes sense, when you're creating volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents that are based on specific PVCs, to have those same labels. Because if the user is saying, I'm labeling everything for this particular application, including PVCs to include in the backup, then when we create the volume snapshot contents and the volume snapshots, we put those same labels on there. That tells Velero to include it too, and that should solve the problem for us. Also, it makes sense because you're already labeling these. The PVCs already have labels anyway, or they wouldn't be included. And you also avoid having to worry about label selectors in the backup in cases where the PVCs don't have labels, and you don't need them.
Yeah. And so this actually breaks the backup workflow, and during the backup workflow, we also have a cleanup step, right? Like delete snapshots. So if your plugin doesn't execute on creation of VSCs and VS, that also goes to nil pointer exception. I think we even saw that. So I can put that up as well.
Okay, I think in the current CSI plugin code, it's already adding the backups name in the labels. So maybe.
Yeah, but the backups name labels doesn't help us here because you're not going to create a backup with a label selector saying I only want to back up things that have this backups label already on them because they're not necessarily going to have that on them. The label selector for backup is going to be something related to your application, or a user creates labels and labels their resources ahead of time. That's what the label selector and the backup is going to point to.
I think Xun's point is that we have a contract to make Velero be possible to, skip the label checking logic for some resources returned by the BIA plugin. But let's continue the discussion.
Yeah, I think that changes the contract. I think we would have to talk about that in a separate issue, because I think users are expecting a certain thing right now, and that changes the functionality, because now you're saying that if I put something to exclude resources, I can't guarantee it's excluded, for example.
Right, so because if it's returned by the BIA, it has to be included in the backup. But yeah, let's continue the discussion in the this issue. I think that's the right thing to do anyway. But yeah, let's continue the discussion offline. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thanks. And not what to answer, Daniel, please.
Yeah, could you click the link? Yeah, as I'm checking the workload for 110, I noticed there are still 2 issues has 110 candidate RH, I think added by Dylan. I think we're okay to remove them, right, Scott?
Yes, so I mean, I think the CSI plugin GA was tied into having data mover in upstream in Velero, wasn't that, Shubham? Is that?
Yeah. That was tied into data mover, but CSI plugin is already GA. So.
Oh yeah,
I guess CSI plugin cannot GA without data mover. Sorry.
Are we still in beta, like for CSI plugin?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, and again, the multiple backup and stores concurrently again is something that I think is not, at this point, not reasonable to expect that in 110. So yeah, I think that I agree there. Okay. We're not working on it yet. So.
Okay. I don't have anything further.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And so any other things? If not, we can stop here today. We have overrun.